All right. Sorry about the little late here, Lindsann. Thanks, everybody. This is, I'm going to have to do a little bit of catch-up in the beginning because it's part 2 of something maybe part 1 earlier, which I think 2/3 of you maybe saw the first part, so sorry. The first part, the notes and images are online, so you can grab me afterward if you want to get to those. The recording got eaten by evil spirits, so we don't have that. But, so what I'm going to be looking at is, in addition to being 1850 on, is looking at, I'm not going to be trying to explain a lot of occult concepts because it would be absolutely impossible in like an hour and a half or 2 hours to be like, here's the Kabbalah, here's Hermeticism, here's alchemy. What I'm really looking at is the way that they became a part of avant-garde practice in the 19th century. Which means also the way that they were embedded in actual social relations. So a lot of what we're actually looking at here is how did those ideas infiltrate the avant-garde community, and who were the people who passed these ideas on, developed them. So a lot of it's actually a social history of occultism in the 19th century. In terms of the ways that people in the avant-garde have traditionally looked at occultism, it's basically looking at it for techniques and frameworks for a paradigm shift. It's kind of the big thing that you can look at. So even when the ideas seem completely crazy, and some of the ideas in here seem even crazier than in the first lecture, you know, what it is people trying to get out of the positivist mindset, which is that people are realizing is also being tied in with capitalism, state control, and all these kinds of other things. Although also, in the second half of the 19th century, something that's interesting is that the first half of the century we saw that specifically avant-garde occultists tended to be feminist. In the second half of the century, that seems to flip, and it becomes pretty misogynist, which we're going to see. And you get a stronger reactionary element as well as still some of the anarchist and socialist elements kind of continuing. So, kind of interesting. Basically looking at mysticism, whether it's visionary mysticism, especially in the later part here, people are engaging with mysticism to try to, like, basically do invocation. They're trying to create entities, essentially. The closest thing we have now would be like what's called tulpamancy. It's actually what a lot of these people were involved with. Though that terminology wasn't really being used in the West yet. A lot of work with the, let me see here. A lot of work with the Kabbalah, which makes sense if you think about, you know, people being poets. The Kabbalah, in 2 seconds, is basically the idea that all of reality can be split into 10 aspects, and that if you can reduce things to those aspects, then you can discover the links between everything in the world. Is a horribly boiled down version. Those numbers are linked with letters, and this is what really interests a lot of people in the avant-garde. This idea of what's called gematria within the Kabbalah, which is that each letter is assigned a number, and just as numbers have occult significance, now letters have occult significance, and so you have reasons to start actually composing with letters rather than with meaning, which is obviously moves right into avant-garde practice. Some more gematria stuff. Obviously, a lot of things, like almost everything I'm talking about, is like, here's a very brief view at something you could write a whole book about, and then I'm moving on. So, a lot of stuff to look up later. Hermeticism, which is a huge umbrella term, really, for basically all kinds of knowledge that was rejected in the Middle Ages, and was not quite completely illegal to talk about. Hermeticism was really maybe one of the closest things to the avant-garde in the medieval and Renaissance world. The primary deity of Hermeticism was Hermes Trismegistus, which is a composite Egyptian and Greek god based on Thoth, who is the god of both writing and death. And Hermes, also the god of writing. So you can see how this all kind of comes together. the visual aspect, visual language being used in Hermeticism and alchemy obviously has a huge influence on the avant-garde. We're going to see more of that influence coming into visual artists in this half of the trajectory than we saw in the first half of the lecture. The idea of alchemy, there are still people in the late 19th century doing physical alchemy and trying to transmute lead into gold. We'll kind of mention that, not a whole lot in the avant-garde. In literary and artistic contexts, alchemy was mainly used kind of as looked at as a path toward enlightenment, personal enlightenment. And so, basically the human consciousness is the lead, and the gold is basically a mystic transcendence. But then that can also be moved out to talk about the entirety of society. So the idea of a hermetic society, of a society which has come into touch with everything through understanding all the interconnections between everything. So this again goes back to this idea of correspondences, that one of the key hermetic sayings is as above, so below, microcosm and macrocosm. So if you can recognize, again, the correspondences are basically the secret links that connect everything in the universe. If you can find that, you can transform society. So this is where the political connection comes in to play with the hermetic stuff. Which again, the political element was a little stronger earlier in the century, weirdly. Okay. So this is all stuff that I kind of went over the first bit and wanted to kind of touch on again. Again, I think if we want to think about how people thought about these crazy things going on, the closest thing that we have today probably is chaos magic. The idea that what magical traditions do isn't actually necessarily to connect to an actual deity and have them do things for you, but that magic is a technique for changing consciousness, and you can kind of change out the content within that magical process. That's not exactly how everybody thought of it in the 19th century who was doing this stuff, but I think that's the general kind of area of framework that they were working with. And some of them, I think, this is very much how we were looking at it. All right. So, looking at where we kind of left off, at the end of the last half of the lecture, we got a few people we're picking up. We've already talked about quite a bit, like these guys. Louis Constant was pretty big in the last one. He's going to become a very big figure. This is his wife at the time. They later get divorced. Marie-Noémie Cailliot Constant. So they, right around 1850 to 1852, somewhere in there, they begin getting to know this guy, a Polish emigre living in Paris named Joseph Wronski. So he is a mathematician. A lot of his cosmological system is expressed in mathematical terminology. He is, as you can then guess, really heavily involved with numerology and with the Kabbalah, and with Pythagoreanism, so actually the religion of Pythagoras. The cooler part and how you do the stuff with triangle, basically his basic kind of idea is that, and this is, I haven't been able to read his stuff because there's too much to take because I want to understand a bit. It's basically that he says that if mankind can completely control all of their sensory impressions, that gives them the power to change reality. And that seems to have been the kind of main thrust of his take on what magic was. He calls for a hermetic society, like I just kind of talked about, what he calls an antinomian union. And this would be basically a secret society of enlightened people who would transform society on their own. Which is a lot like St. Simonism, with the utopian socialist movement, kind of touched on the last time with the first half of the lecture, with people had to have people tie up the backs of their costumes so that to get across the thing. No man was an island. They basically wanted an elite an industrial and artistic elite to design a society that would be fair for everybody. Kind of a prototype of this communist dictatorship of the proletariat. So this is what he wants. He works as a math tutor, doesn't really let a lot of people know that he's a Kabbalist and magician, because that will not necessarily help 19th century middle-class people to let you near their kids. So he pretty much lives in constant poverty. He, at one point, invented a trackless locomotive system, which was going to set him up for life. It was like they bought the patent and everything, and then he decided that the math behind it was so important it had to be published for the world. So he published it, and then the people who he'd sold who he was were in negotiations for the patent for, decided he'd just given away their secrets, so they canceled the contract, and he goes back to poverty. He did create something called the prognometer, which was a machine for telling the future. So this is basically described as being like an astrolabe with a lot of moving spheres and disks and pointers. It hasn't survived. The closest thing that we have is a version of it made by another person who I'm not getting into because there are too many people to talk about. But this is basically what one of those cards would have looked like, and after all of the adjustments, it would give you a bunch of data, astrological data, and Kabbalistic data, mathematical data. But if you are him, you're going to be able to read and be able to tell the future, apparently. Even his acolytes were not allowed to actually see it when he was alive. Now, as I say, Abbé Constant was basically initiated by Vronsky. He had already been doing a ton of occult activity, as we saw in the previous lecture. But Joseph Vronsky really, as Levy feels, is the one who initiates him into the real mysteries of the Kabbalah. And it is through that initiation with Vronsky that he decides that he's going to change his name. He chooses a Hebrew name, again, because of the Kabbalah coming out of the Jewish religious tradition, and becomes Eliphas Levi, which is basically how you normally know him these days, if you ever hear about him at all. He actually, a little bit after Vronsky dies, discovers the prognometer in a junk shop, basically in a thrift shop. He just finds it, and he knows that that's what it is, and so he buys it. It's still gone, though, now. Another person we kind of looked at in the last lecture who's still alive, Théophile Gautier. So, a member of pretty much all of the major avant-garde collectives between 1830 and really when he dies in 1872, I want to say. Well, I think it says there, yeah, 1872. So Gautier is continuing to promote the cult of art, this idea that religion has become a destructive force, and that the human needs that religion fulfills, art is the best thing to fulfill in the 19th century because it is something you can change and develop, and that doesn't necessitate killing each other over. And so he's still promoting the cult of art, and this becomes kind of one of the central ideologies of the avant-garde throughout the 19th century. He's really the social center of the avant-garde until his death, at which point it really moves on to Mallarmé. He mentors most of the avant-garde between 1840 and 1870. We're only looking here at the people who are also involved with occultism. His own hermetic practice was probably not real deep. He wasn't doing magic. He was reading stuff. It was more that he was interested in the occult, and all of his friends were involved in the occult. He was kind of a detached observer a little bit. He found it interesting, but he was, I think, too materialist to really take on a lot of it. He was interested in hermeticism and all the applications of magic that don't sound too crazy, let's just say. He'd never tried to kill somebody with his mind, like some of the people we're going to be looking at in a bit. But he did have an influence. He was very interested in altered states of reality, which comes in the 19th century mainly through the techniques associated with magic and spiritualism. Very interested in the text reading as meditation and writing as a form of meditation. Again, a lot of the people he mentors become involved with occultism. So there's something going on there. Here are some of the main avant-garde hermeticists mentored by him, some of which most of you will probably recognize, some of which probably very few of you will recognize. But he's diffusing a lot of these ideas. New guy, Paul-François Gaspard Lecuria, a Gnostic numerologist. So Gnosticism is just getting big in the late 19th century as they're beginning to translate more Gnostic texts. The Nag Hammadi find is still a century away. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still not quite a century away, but very far away. What they're looking at are actually things by Christian bishops against heresies, as well as some archaeological finds in Greece and Rome of Gnostic artifacts and trying to reconstruct things from that. It's a lot of it. It's not unlike the kind of neo-pagan revival today. A lot of it is made up because there's just not that much left. But they're doing what they can with what's left for them to work from. So 1848, he writes a book called Harmonies of Being. He had actually founded a Catholic college. Once he published this, he was kicked out of his own college. I haven't been able to read it, but apparently it's fairly heretical. He considers numerology to be the basis for all of existence. After he's kicked out, he comes to Paris, and he becomes a big part of the Parisian underground, pretty much from the 1840s through the 1880s. People in the Parisian underground communities are hanging out at his house. Among his acolytes are, as we can see here, the composer Charles Gounod, who, as it happens, was trained by a Saint Symbolist. I mentioned the Saint Symbolist a few times, from Montel-Hillevi. He also trains Joseph Péladan, which we'll be seeing a lot. He's one of the weirdest people in the avant-garde, probably in the 19th century. So you got him coming up really around about the 1850s is when people are beginning to know who he is. I cannot explain this exactly right now, but we're starting to see, you can see some of the graphic influence of Hermeticism here. And then there's this guy and this woman, not pictured, the Abbé Boulon. Okay, so Abbé Joseph Antoine Boulon is a Satanist priest, which you find a lot of in the 1880s and 90s. Initially, he was just a priest. In 1856, he met Sister Odile Chevalier, who I can't find a picture of, who was speaking to angels, basically, apparently. So she comes to the monastery where he was, and basically the two of them work together and they start a charitable organization called the Work of the Reparation of Souls. What they do there officially is people come in and they work miracles. The church is not real fond of miracles at this time, though, because most of them are by charlatans, if not all of them, depending. But certainly, even according to the church, most of them are by charlatans. So the church is already like, okay, I guess work those miracles. I guess it's helping peasants to like us, but well, reports start to come out that what they're actually doing, that he is, for instance, curing devil possession by spitting in people's mouths, by wrapping them in poultices smeared in excrement, forcing nuns to drink urine as part of their rites, and practicing sex magic. So obviously the church isn't real fond of this. They look into it. They can't quite prove anything. In 1860, apparently, her child, the two of them sacrifice in one of their rituals. Kill and sacrifice her child. Still, the church can't pin it on them, although there are, and this is weird, but in the scholarship, like strange people are like, well, there's a letter in the Vatican. We can't say what's in it. And I'm like, okay. But at any rate, apparently they killed this child in 1860. The church keeps putting him in jail, and he keeps getting back out again. The church can't get rid of him, weirdly. Finally, in 1875, 15 years later, they managed to defrock him. Even then, he goes on to edit a theological newspaper, which has a big influence in the 19th century, called the Annals of Sanctity. Let me see here, sorry. Yeah. And he starts basically a heretical commune where he lives with two holy women, one of whom is Adele Chevalier, the other of whom is named Julie Thibault, who also has visions and lives only on bread and milk, which is extremely holy, so it appears. This is the host that he uses, consecrated by another earlier heretical occultist who I'm not really getting into because it's too many names. So we're going to see all of these people coming back throughout the century. Another thing that happens that has a big influence, probably a big reason why, as I say, occultism becomes less political, especially on the left, in the 1850s, is that in 1852, Napoleon III takes power in a coup d'etat. France becomes a totalitarian regime, and most people who have been involved with socialist activism are either forced to be quiet, stop publishing, or flee the country. Including both of these guys. Mascaros we talked about a lot in the first half of the lecture. He basically stops writing after this point. And he flees to England. Victor Hugo goes to Guernsey. Hugo's had a long, crazy history already by this point. Didn't get into it much in the first lecture, but he started out as a royalist in the 1820s. In the 1830 or so, he becomes a liberal. By the 1840s, he's a socialist. And in 1848, he becomes, after the revolution, he briefly is made so he's elected to the Chamber of Deputies. So he serves as basically a congressman for a couple of years until Napoleon III's coup d'etat. Initially, he was like, Napoleon III's great. He's Napoleon's grandson. How could he be bad? But then Napoleon III took over, and Victor Hugo was like, you, I trusted you, and had to flee the country. So he's living outside. He's living on an island, on the island of Guernsey, for most of the second half of the 19th century. We'll be talking about him a bit more, too, in a minute. I don't know why Gnosticism's over here. Anyway. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know why I've got that here. I'm going to skip Gnosticism for the moment.
Slide out of order.
Woo. What's that?
So you got to slide out of order.
Yeah, actually, no, I'll go ahead and do this now. Okay, I did talk about Gnosticism a little bit, not a whole lot. Basic idea of Gnosticism is that it is dualistic. Matter and spirit are opposed to each other. And basically, existence is a matter of non-existence, which has become more and more progressively ruined by existence, essentially. So you have a huge number of deities, and there are a huge number of versions of Gnosticism that I'm not going to get into. But basically, so here you have this hierarchy of spirits and emanations, essentially. But gnosis means knowledge. The basic idea of gnosis is mystical, that the individual can reach enlightenment through knowledge and through self-understanding. Eastern religious philosophies are coming into play at this time too, more than in the first half of the century, as more stuff is being translated. You have people translating Eastern religious texts, and not necessarily totally understanding them, but at least starting to try to think about what they mean. And a lot of what people are picking up on is the non-dualistic aspects of Eastern thought, which is kind of at odds with Gnosticism. And spiritualism is getting very big in the second half of the century as well. Aspects of spiritualism that really influenced the avant-garde: shamanism, the idea that people who are mediums are in a trance state. And whether or not people believed that they were being possessed, they did understand that this was a trance state. And you really see this with surrealists, when the surrealists were holding seances. People like Robert Duneau was a medium, and his participation was particularly valued in the group because of that, not because any of them thought they were speaking to the spirits of the dead, but because they realized or thought they were speaking to the unconscious. So if you take spirit and replace it with unconscious, a lot of spiritualism essentially becomes surrealism. Automatic writing, the first description I've seen in the avant-garde of automatic writing is Théophile Gautier writing in 1838, and it's in the context of a person who falls in love with a ghost, and the only way that they can communicate with each other is if he lets her take over his body and write letters to him with his own hand. And table tapping, and which is basically you ask the thing, whatever it is, a question, the table, bong, 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 bong. Typically, if it's the letter C, it's bong, bong, bong. And E, bong, 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 bong. So this actually gets people thinking about writing in letters. Again, moving toward the later 20th century practice of letristic poetry. This brings us back to Victor Hugo, and why I brought him up in the first place. So there's a lot interesting happening with Hugo. Even back before the period we're talking about, he was hugely influenced by Nodier, who I talked about a bit, and Makivich. Hugo, like Makivich, saw himself as basically a medium for the spirit of France, or even for the spirit of the 19th century. He was awesome, and he knew it. So he really saw himself as an instrument that poetry spoke through. Essentially a prophetic role. Kind of a half-secular prophet, but not an entirely secular prophet, really. And this was also something that a lot of people around him believed. So the Jeune France group, who I looked at in the first lecture, actually had a first edition of his Cromwell, with the founding manifesto of Romanticism, hanging on their wall as a religious icon. So he already had this kind of status. He also had a lot of friends interested in occultism. So these are all people involved with the Romanticist movement who were involved with occultism, all of whom hung out with Victor Hugo. And all of these people who we've either seen in the previous half of the lecture and or will be seeing more of now. So yeah, he's thinking a lot about occultism. It doesn't come into play in his own life immediately. In 1843, his daughter Leopoldine dies. She drowns, and he can't accept it. And so this is when he starts getting into spiritualism and trying to contact her beyond the grave. So he starts holding seances, and he keeps holding seances for over a decade, pretty regularly. He starts by using the Ouija board, and then what he starts doing is sometimes attaching a pencil to the Ouija board and letting the spirit draw automatically rather than write. And so you have here in the 1840s Victor Hugo doing automatic drawing, 80 years before the Surrealists. He is also doing a lot of drawings. In these drawings, again, they're automatic drawings without the Ouija board. He might start with an ink blot or whatever, an accident. He is using ink, pencil, coal dust, soot, coffee, and his own blood to draw with. A lot of the time he'll intentionally draw with his left hand because he can use his hand that he's not good with. Again, he saw it as a way of contacting the unconscious. He starts using frottage techniques, like syncing, again, surrealist technique, soaking lace in ink and using that to do pattern and then drawing stuff off of the pattern. Going to take a look at some of those drawings. So these are spirit drawings by Victor Hugo. These are done in the 1840s and 50s. So you can start to see, I mean, he's not alone here. He hangs out with a lot of artists. He's not the only person doing this kind of thing. This is where abstraction is coming from. Also, letristic stuff. This is his, these are his initials. He's turned his initials into a giant flying dragon thing. So, while he is at Guernsey, he and his family are doing, almost every day they're having seances. Between September of 1853 and October of 1855, they record 500 pages of spirit communications. All of them tapped out one letter at a time by a table. Yeah. So he interviewed a lot of interesting people, including Voltaire, Moses, Dante, Galileo, Jesus, the ocean, Hannibal, Muhammad, Napoleon, Racine, and Shakespeare. Shakespeare spoke in French because he said English wasn't as good, which is convenient since nobody in Victor Hugo's family spoke English. So, also his daughter. And let me see here. Yeah, so he interviews Death himself, which is pretty interesting. It's interesting looking at some of the transcripts, because Hugo gets really, impatient with the ghost sometimes, because he'll be like, yo, you use this metaphor, but it doesn't seem to work really well, it kind of bothers me. And then the ghost will be tap out, you were right, I should have used a different synonym, or whatever. He's constantly second-guessing the ghost. He's your logic's not consistent here. And it's sorry, let me explain. It's kind of odd. Whoa, what happened? Oh, no, God, no. Okay, just a sec, sorry. I mean, I have to put things down. Okay. So I'm going to read a short passage from that here.
To start and stop.
So this is some weird stuff. Alright. So this is Death speaking to Victor Hugo. It's describing, basically, Death seems to speak in prose poems to Hugo. So here's what it's saying. It's already mid-description of some scene. Suddenly, the stone of a tomb, the stone lifts up, the tomb inscription moves, and someone emerges from the sepulchre. It is the spirit. What has it come to do? It comes to live again. It comes to speak. It comes to fight. It comes to take the place of the living. It becomes a man. He goes out. He runs and fills the world. He starts the heavy screws of the terrible presses turning and makes the frightened lead letters jump with the giddy pace of his breathing. He is in the steam boiler, in the wheels of the machine, in its strange levers that can be glimpsed as they move in the print shop, sending out their works of death into the night. He is in the streets, brusquely coming to surprise the world in its sleep, and he, the unknown, arrives like something unexpected and becomes the dream of our century whose idea itself he embodies. No more arguments, the man is dead, and his verses are hunting crows. So, it reads a lot like automatic writing, interestingly. Yeah, so Hugo's kind of doing this, unfortunately, all by himself out in Guernsey, but he does have a lot of people in the Romanticist community going out to visit him pretty regularly. At one point, Death actually, one thing Hugo is always surprised at is that Death tends to quote lines from his own poetry at him that he's not published. So there are several times in just the short stuff that I've read where Death will say something and Hugo's like, wait, did you know that I wrote almost that exact same line 2 days ago? And Death will be like, no, I didn't know that. That's crazy. But interestingly, Hugo was not at the table. It was his son who was mainly doing the actual table tapping. So it wasn't just Hugo's unconscious. it was maybe his unconscious via his son, who very likely read his manuscripts. But anyway, I don't know. So Hugo's out doing his thing. Let's see here. Meanwhile, you've got basically what's called the occult revival is happening in France. So this is largely Eliphas Levi, who is publishing a lot of books that are actually getting read about the history of the occult, and he is talking about how all the different occult traditions are related. So it's largely because of his writings that now people involved in the occult think of the Kabbalah, the Kabbalah and Hermeticism and alchemy and Buddhism and Gnosticism all as being kind of combined, and especially the Kabbalah being kind of the spine of all of these relationships. That a lot of it comes from Eliphas Levi. So, meantime, in art, we've got art and poetry. The Contemporary Parnassus. This is an avant-garde group, started in 1866, and it's the first avant-garde group that is definitively not romanticist, although there are still a lot of ex-romanticists involved in it. The Parnassians are basically based in the cult of art that I talked about with Gautier, who is a member of the group. Most of the people who start the group are mentored by Gautier. So really cult of art, and they are reapproaching mythology from an avant-garde perspective, trying to reinvent the way that society relates to mythology as something that you can combine pantheons and play with and personalize. They're also trying to depersonalize the emotionalism that's in a lot of romanticist stuff to kind of try to get at the kind of cold reality of things. But when I say reality, I actually mean like the Platonic idea, which is exactly not reality. So, let me see here. Here are some of those people. These are the people who are involved with Hermeticism with the group. Again, people we'll be seeing again later. Again, Gautier, who mentored most of the rest. Catulle Mende, who is the main organizer. So they, a lot of their beliefs are modeled off of Greek pantheism. So they're often charged with worshiping Greek gods. And then their answers are something to the effect of, well, define worship, define God. It's not exactly a no, but it's not exactly a yes. The main organizer is Catulle Mende, again, mentored by Gautier. A lot of the ideas that Mende puts out there for Parnassianism involve poetry, especially the process of poetry, the actual process of writing as a sacred act. It's a meditative act, and the poem is the place where symbolic and alchemical correspondences come together and affect the human mind. Is really kind of the way that they're looking at it. Keep in mind that the Western meditative tradition, which is less popular in the West now than Eastern meditative traditions, which is an interesting thing. When people think meditation, they tend to think passive Buddhist-style meditation. Western-style traditional meditation is reading. It's monks actually reading as a meditative process. So this is actually a resurrection and a radicalization of a very traditional practice that they're promoting. They're very interested in the music of vowels, which actually goes back to Gnosticism. The idea that each vowel is related to a particular musical tone, which is related to the planets, and thus to astrology, and thus to numerology, and thus to Kabbalah. And they look at a poem, which is always supposed to be read aloud, as essentially, now we would call a microtonal song. It's a song, but the pitches suggested by the vowels are so subtle they would fit within a single interval in the Western musics. And that's how they think of what poetry is. But all of those have occult meanings. So Catulle Mende organizes it. Gautier, as I say, was kind of a father figure to him, which you would think then when Mende was like, hey, I would like to marry your daughter, Gautier would say, yeah, but he says no. She marries him anyway, and unfortunately, it turns out he's an abusive asshole. So, fuck that guy. She divorces him pretty quickly. And she then goes on to actually become one of the first major translators of Japanese into French. And a pretty important and respected Orientalist scholar. So that is Mende. Probably the most. I'm going to read a little bit of one of Mende's stories, which is crazy. Mende kind of comes out of the school of Baudelaire, and I can't do all of this because there's too much of it, but also because this isn't work real well in this one. Oh dear.
Wait for a second.
Yeah, just for a second. Sorry, everybody, because this is going to hurt. But this is a crazy passage, though. Yeah, thanks. So, in this passage, is this the one? Yeah. This is a huge lesbian Satanist rite that he is describing. I should mention, his take on lesbianism is very weird. He is approving, but it also manages to come off as extraordinarily misogynist. And when I say comes off as, I also mean is intended as. But it's crazy. So I'm just going to skip around a little bit here because there's too much of it to do all at once. But make sure I'm starting in the right spot here. And then, out of a cloud of smoke that tore like a veil, appeared on the altar a colossal form. Had she emerged from the depths of hell? Had she descended from the clear nocturnal empyrean? She was black, red, and golden. She stood there, diabolical, celestial, prodigious. She was terrible in the enormity of her grace, and yet seductive in the boundlessness of her terror. You could just make out the form of the tortured enchantress. And dominating the voices of the kneeling sisters, her laughter, Sophor recognized it, rang out like a victory bell. A woman by her heavy long hair, her mysterious gaze, her lips as bright as a blood-red kiss, a beast by the golden coat that covered her arms and legs, and by her goat's face. She was the female Satan of the Sabbath without men, and while on her horned forehead, like a female satyr's, glowed a strange diadem of dark diamonds, suggesting a constellation of accursed stars, the demoness with divine eyes gathering up to her navel her gold and scarlet dress, immodestly displayed and proffered like a monstress for their adoration, her tawny sex. Then the lovers, reaching out their arms, waving their perfumed hair at her. Smile, ineffable mistress, on those who scorn the conjugal bed and curse the cradle. This is what they're shouting to her. When we walk through the town, young men signal us to follow them and want to take us by the hand, but ridiculing the thick beard that dishonors their chins, we turn instead toward our friends with quivering lips barely covered with golden down. Smile, ineffable mistress, on those who scorn the conjugal bed and curse the cradle. Let's see. And then later on here. Through the parted crowd, dressed not in linen or silk, but in fresh red blood, advanced women with knives in their hands. They were like sacrificers, still scarlet from a hecatomb. Behind them you could hear mothers fleeing and shrieking loudly, holding their babies in their arms. The bloody woman extended toward the altar's baskets in which palpitated the virile members of newborn boys. They strewed these offerings like bizarre flowers at the feet of the demoness. The latter made a sign, and suddenly, emerging with grunts and howls, wild pigs rushed forward and invaded the altar. And, while the living idol was laughing tremendously, they ate the bleeding future of the human race. And it goes on. So there's Catullman Day. Thanks. Yeah. Not surprising then, he was friends with Charles Baudelaire, another member of the Prentice Contemporain, who is probably one of the people we're most familiar with here. So Baudelaire was involved with alchemy, he's involved with hermeticism, and he's involved with Gnosticism. He was reading Wronski. Let me look at, here we go. So he was reading Wronski, and he was personal friends with Eliphas Levi. They actually collaborated together on a book. He was very concerned with correspondences. Again, this idea of symbols that connect to other things that allow you to tie the world back into itself, essentially. Correspondences in symbols and in colors and in vowels themselves. He wrote an essay on Wagner as a hermetic poet of sound. He, if you'll remember, maybe remember, was involved with the Club of Hashishan, the Assassins Club or Hashish Smokers Club in the 1840s. He wrote a whole book on opium and hashish, describing his visions. And drug visions in the 19th century were associated with occultism, as we'll be seeing some more. He is involved with Satanism, not with Satan worship. More of a kind of a literary, symbolic kind of Satanism. He approaches Satan as a social symbol for the marginalized and as a kind of a personal symbol for what happens to the artist in a modern age, essentially. He relates it, not surprisingly, to the idea of Baphomet, which was described by Eliphas Levi, his friend. So this is kind of the central kind of occult element of Baudelaire. Another one of his friends, another member of the Cornas contemporane, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, was basically a French symbolist horror writer and playwright. He actually died 139 years this very day, for what it's worth. Again, very involved with Hermeticism, mentored by Gautier, again, very close to Gérard de Nerval, who was pretty heavily in the last lecture, though he's dead by now. Mentored by them. Philo Theonetti, again, gone now. Eliphas Levi, and Askeros, who's also pretty much gone now. He's a friend of Eliphas Levi, and collaborated with him as well, actually, on a book on Parisian theater. So Eliphas Levi is pretty heavily involved with all of this stuff. Villiers has a novel, really interesting novel, called The Future Eve. It's the first novel about androids, actually. It's a turn on the Galatea, the Pygmalion and Galatea story. The main character is Thomas Edison, but Thomas Edison is portrayed as a modern magician, and science is portrayed as the modern magic. And so he creates this android to love, and the whole thing is, as most android stories, is she real at this point or not? But it's very interesting in that throughout he's constantly saying, he has Edison like complaining about positivist science and saying, I am a mage, I am a modern magus. Really interesting novel. He made basically a hermetic play called Axel's Castle, which was really kind of the seminal work of symbolist theater. So there are some of those influences that I should have shown you earlier. We're going to, again, I'm sorry, this is what got a little bit out of order, but I'm going to read a short Baudelaire poem here. It's called The Alchemy of Suffering. Weirdly, I'm just going to do this. Well, that helps, actually.
All right, go.
So, thanks. It's the paper quality makes the difference.
No phosphorus in that paper.
Right, yeah.
Sometimes.
They call them optical brighteners. It's to make the paper more white.
Well, they need to put them in there. All right. So this is a Baudelaire poem, not a VA poem, sorry. Alchemy of Suffering. One's ardor nature makes you bright. One finds within you mourning, grief. What speaks to one of tombs and death says to the other, splendor, life. Mystical Hermes, help to me, intimating though you are. You make me Midas' counterpart, no sadder alchemist than he. My gold is iron by your spell, and paradise turns into hell. I see in winding sheets of clouds a dear cadaver in its shroud, and there upon celestial strands I raise huge tombs above the sands. So you get kind of the personal nature of Satan to Baudelaire, and actually that refers to what he considers his personal deity, Satan Trismegistus, which is a combination of Hermes Trismegistus. He does mention Hermes in there, with kind of Eliphas Levi's version of Satan. All right, moving on to French decadent occultism. As we keep moving weirder. Okay. So there's decadence and symbolism. One or two avant-garde movements of the late 19th century. Depends on who you ask. They're almost kind of two sides of the same coin. Most of the people involved with one, you can basically say are involved with the other. It's another lecture to actually get into that taxonomy. Basically, the prime period for symbolism is 1884 to about 1914, roughly. So in 1889, the Symbolist, Avant-Garde Symbolist journal in Vogue, which is, gets printed by a printer called Arcturus, who is an occult printer in Paris, because apparently when the symbolists go to him to ask if he'll print their journal, he says, "Are you adepts?" And they give him their occult reading list, and he decides they're cool enough to print. So this is how closely involved symbolism was with the occult. Symbolism, again, I'm going to give you a very basic rundown of an extremely complicated movement. You can look at it in this context as kind of a synchronic kind of thing. They're combining a lot of different canons. And it's really, symbolism's kind of a form of I would say, atheist mysticism, in a way. They want to keep the techniques and the symbolic resonance of mysticism, although they are no longer capable of believing in God in a straightforward way. Some of them find ways to believe in God in a very not straightforward way, but they cannot resign themselves to the straightforward way anymore because society has gotten too crazy and Darwin exists. Poetry and art here are hermetic processes. Obviously, this is still the cult of art, right? It's just becoming more and more complicated. They look at poetry and art essentially as a form of verbal cognitive alchemy. What a piece of artwork does is it changes your consciousness. Your consciousness is the iron. The poem is the philosopher's stone, both for the person writing it and the person reading it. The person writing it doesn't have something they're giving to you. They're creating it in the same process, the other side of the same coin, again, of the process that you're creating as you read it. The correspondences, colors, images, sounds are, again, still very, very important in symbolism. They're very interested in synesthesia, and in the idea that musical sounds are related to specific colors, to specific vowel sounds. And they create whole systems out of this and write whole poems based on these systems. They write poems they consider to be symphonic. They figure out the vowels first, and then they figure out what the meaning should be. Kind of like how Poe talks about writing his own poetry. They're looking at poetic rhythm as a direct communication of nervous pulses or energy codes from one consciousness to the other. What makes me who I am? It's the specific kinds of patterns that I tend to think in, and the way that those relate to my actual physiology. So what a poem does in its very specific rhythm is communicate a specific moment in my being to you, the reader, by making those same rhythms flow through your body and mind. This is the idea of symbolist poetry. So again, this is basically a magical concept. You're using words and language to directly affect another person. So this is kind of their idea. They're also very, very interested in the unconscious. They're the people who start using that term. They're looking at dreams. They're looking at the way that archetypes, dreams in the way that surrealists will. Looking at archetypes in the way that Jung is going to, or Joseph Campbell. Kind of trying to think about the relationships between the unconscious, specific individual psychology, and culture. Politically, it's really heterogeneous. There are anarchist socialists. There are anarchist symbolists. There are socialist symbolists. There are also monarchist symbolists. As late as 1890, there are ultra-Catholic symbolists. It's all over the place. They all somehow kind of get along-ish, for the most part. The most important, I almost went too far, is Stéphane Mallarmé. Mentored by Gautier, after Gautier dies, his apartment basically becomes the center of the avant-garde in Paris, and he mentors most of the poets of the next generation. Pretty much all the poets up until the Dadas, who were a little bit young because he died young. Even his cat is descended from Baudelaire's cat. This is how closely the avant-garde is watching its own inheritance at this time. He's the main theorist of symbolist poetry. Here are some of the people we'll be talking about who he mentored. I think there probably should be more in there, actually. But again, these are only the occultists in the avant-garde. It's just that crossover in the Venn diagram. He's the main theorist of basically everything that I just told you. He's kind of the primary person to theorize. He publishes in a fair number of anarchist journals, and socialist journals. He is the primary developer of free verse, especially free verse that is, I guess what I would say was visual poetry. The Symbolists were the first to do free verse. He wasn't the very first to do it, but his poem Un coup d'idée is one of the absolute landmarks in the development of verse, basically, in the way that he uses the page and develops visual poetry. He has an 1893 essay about magic, which I have not been able to track down and find in time, so sorry about that. What apparently it talks about is that because society is abandoning magic, he says there are two paths open to continuing to fulfill the needs that magic used to fulfill. One of those is political economy, in other words, socialism, which he says derives from alchemy. And the other is aesthetics, which he says derives from sorcery. And so the poet, he says, is a modern sorcerer, which goes back to that idea of like transference of bodily pulses that I was talking about. So he talks about poetry as a form of atheist mysticism, talks about writing as the collapse of materiality and the veil of consciousness. I'm going to read a short passage. We'll see if it... curses. I'm sorry. Well, from one of his letters.
Keep me awake.
I guess so, right? Wait.
Yeah.
So...
Came out weird, huh?
Yeah, I see how it is. So this is his letter, part of his letter from the 14th of May, 1867, and this is describing basically the kind of break in consciousness that he had, that kind of led him on this path. So he says, he's writing to his friend after not writing to him for almost a full year. I've just spent a terrifying year. My thought has thought itself and reached a pure concept. All that my being has suffered as a result during that long death cannot be told. But, fortunately, I am utterly dead, and the least pure region where my spirit can venture is eternity. My spirit, that recluse accustomed to dwelling in its own purity, is no longer darkened even by the reflection of time. Unfortunately, I've reached this point through a dreadful sensitivity, and it's high time I wrapped it in an outward indifference which will replace my lost strength. After a final synthesis, I have reached the stage of slowly acquiring that strength. You can see I am unable to distract myself. But this was even more the case a few months ago, firstly in my terrible struggle with that old and evil plumage, which is now, happily, vanquished, God. But as that struggle has taken place on his bony wing, which, in death throes more vigorous than I would have suspected him capable of, had carried me into the shadows, I fell, victorious, desperately and infinitely, and at last I saw myself again in my Venetian mirror, such as I was when I forgot myself several months before. I confess, moreover, but to you alone, that the torments inflicted by my triumph were so great, I still need to look at myself in that mirror in order to think, and that if it were not in front of this desk on which I'm writing to you, I would become the void once again. That will let you know that I am now impersonal, and no longer the Stefan that you knew, but a capacity possessed by the spiritual universe to see itself and develop itself through what was once me. So, and there's going to be another one in a minute, so...
There's like a Tibetan practice, like a
Marxism is super aggressive,
Right.
and all of your meditation is way like this from the ego.
Right.
This is what
Which makes sense, yeah. And there's a long, if I were to get into it, there's a long tradition of, in the avant-garde, like, yeah, people staring into mirrors and shit, as you know. Yeah, and he was reading some of the, it's not unlikely that was in there, because he was reading Eastern philosophy as well. So, yeah. And so here's a poem, and so his process was basically, a lot of his poems are sonnets, but those sonnets would take him sometimes 20, 30 years to write. He would be writing them all at once and would just work back into it again and again and again. And in that idea of dissolving reality, the way he did that in the poem was to basically describe an object, and then you take that description and you describe the description, and you describe that description, and you describe that description. You metaphorize until the point when you make the object disappear, and the only thing that's left are the psychological resonances of the object. And that's all you have in the poem. A lot of his poems actually can be read as being about two completely different subject matters at the same time, because he makes such careful use of the grammatical ambiguities of French that sentences can say two different things at once. It's an incredibly meticulous process. So this is a poem of his called The Gift of the Poem. I bring to you the child of an Idumean night, black with featherless wings bled white. Through the windows burnished with incense and gold, the rhymed pains mournful, alas, from the cold. The dawn spread her fingers upon the angelic lamp, and when she had offered this relic to the Father, smiling in spite of his qualms, the sterile blue silence was wafted by palms. O mother cradling your infant daughter, welcome the birth of this untimely monster. And with your voice like viol and harpsichord, O singer, will you press upon your breast a faded finger, through which in sibylline whiteness woman flows, for lips starred from the air the virginal azure blows? Alright, so Mallarmé. Yeah, we got a little while. So Mallarmé, like I say, is kind of the center of the Symbolist movement. Rémy de Gourmont is right up there also in terms of importance to the movement for a lot of reasons. Again, mentored by by Mallarmé. So, where am I? Right there. So Gourmont is a writer, he's a theorist, one of the most important avant-garde publishers. One of the most important avant-garde publishers of the time. A librarian and Liberté. So he was doing a lot of stuff. Also one of Alfred Jarry's best friends, and and then one of his greatest enemies, as we'll see. Don't need that yet. Okay, so Gourmont has an idea called what he calls the dissociation of ideas, which is essentially applying alchemy to thought. What he says is that there are a lot of ideas that society considers to be one and the same, or always combined, and that society moves forward by dissociating those ideas and separating them. So I'm trying to think of what some of the examples are. He talks about masculinity and militarism. These are things that always seem to come together. So for Gourmont, he says, well, if you dissociate these ideas, what new ideas can you form by taking these apart and recombining them? Essentially an alchemical process applied to thought. That's one of the ways that his hermetic thought kind of comes through in his written work. With Bert Courier, who we'll be looking at a lot later, he is having a lot of seances at his home. He and she are involved with sex magic. You see a lot of that in the 1880s and 90s. And he's involved with avant-garde Satanism. We're going to be coming back to him pretty soon. I'm just introducing him right now. Paul Adam, also one of the symbolists, mentored by Mallarmé. He's a poet, an anarchist, anarchist publisher, and activist. and a magus or magician, basically. In the 19th century, they liked the word magus. It had more majesty, I guess. He co-edited a symbolist-anarchist journal called Étretion with a poet named Viollet-Griffin, who some of you will know because he was from Virginia, and he wrote sound poetry in the 1880s, which I performed here at the previous AfterMAF. So this was one of his closest collaborators. He had prophetic visions of World War I during the 1890s. At one point, he was visited by an evil spirit, apparently. Again, we'll be seeing more on him a little bit later. And Alfred Jarry, again, one of the 3 or 4 people that you might recognize in this whole lecture, maybe, becomes, of course, probably the biggest influence in the 19th century on the Dada movement, and arguably the Surrealists. He's a symbolist poet and an anarchist. A lot of Hermeticist friends, as we can see. So these are, again, all friends of his whom he's hanging out with, and a lot of these guys you've already seen. The rest we'll be seeing in a little bit. So he very, very heavily involved with Hermeticism. So much so it's almost hard to kind of actually talk about. If you've only read Ubuwa, then you won't see it. If you've read anything else by him, then it's all over the place. So when people would come to his apartment, he would have initiations, Gothic-style initiations, where you'd have skeletons falling on you from the door and bats releasing your face and stuff. But more substantially, he was, if you look at his science of pataphysics, which is kind of an anti-logic. Again, I don't have time to go into pataphysics really for people who don't know much about it, but the idea is it's science or logic used against itself to undermine its own assumptions. And it has a lot of dimensions, and one of them that people don't always see is the hermetic aspect of it. Because that anti-rationalist aspect of it is related to mysticism and to hermeticism and again to magic. He was very involved with evocatory processes. He would, a lot of his novels, which are biographical novels, describe basically creating entities, creating, either calling down or really, for him, it's creating spirits, creating a consciousness that he can interact with. A lot of the time he uses a mirror. So he's doing this stuff, very, very involved with iconography. So he and Gourmand together edit a symbolist journal called Imagier, which is, it combines avant-garde printmaking with medieval printmaking, side by side. He's very, very interested in this iconography. So, this is one of the medieval icons that he published in his own magazine. This is his own drawing of Ubuwa. This is his own drawing of the staging, or for the poster for the play Ubuwa, which is one of the kind of turning points in the history of the avant-garde. He, in a lot of his work, basically treats the aspects of a story that are specifically written as if they are realities. So, anything that you can write can become real in pataphysics, in a sense. And the logic of grammar can infect reality. Or he has an entire play in which all the characters and stage directions are given in the language of heraldry, and things like this. So his work is very, very densely hermetic. And let's see if this... Come on, Atlas. See, Atlas Press uses proper fucking paper.
Reset the camera.
Okay. Yeah, we can stop there, Billy.
There we go.
All right, sweet. All right, so I'm going to read a short poem. Which one is it? Sonnet number 2. Okay. No, this is 3. Okay. This is a short poem by Jarry. It's Animal, and this is from a series of 3 poems on animal, vegetable, and mineral. So, and you can see the influence of Mallarmé because you won't understand anything. So, Animal. In cloth of gold he thrones, contemplative, with golden pince-nez on his bourbon nose. The souls of his admiring throng misgive when blazing yellow eyes seek out their trembling bones. He's old and wise, and justice deals from elder loan, the same Athene chose when counsel thought to give. He has to choose the sentence, spirit quiddative, before he executes his gauge-long riffs he hones. The softly spoken owl politely bids you hearken to your death, the hour has rung. His name 3 times behind the chamber door he's sung. He reads the tombs, the futures ciphered on their lids. He perches near the X of sleeping, crossed femurs, and sees in dreams the stones of the philosophers. Which is a kind of a symbolic knot it would take a long time to get through, to really go through and figure out what all is going on in here. Because each of those images has about 8 different directions you can interpret it, each of which can be related to all the other interpretations. Also going to do just a little bit from scene 1 of Caesar Antichrist. Which is very short. This is St. Peter speaking, seen almost from behind, his eyes left. The wandering Jew walks the universe. The Pope sits in the center of his cobweb. I am a great tree and a polyp under the blue of the liquid air. And then the green Christ says, Upon thee, Peter, have I built my church, as my voice of bronze said unto thee in the beginning. And then the pillory turns 120 degrees. Then St. Peter says, Thrice did I deny God, and by my denial, triple act of faith, have I created this upside-down trinity, whose loving arms are suffocating me. Christ of gold, sculpted by Hermes Trismegistus, whose Chinese pigtail grows on the spot where germinated the penultimate roots of the Christ that was before history. Why didst thou not crush me and my blasphemous cowardliness with thine architectural fall? The golden Christ says, The right cheek smitten, turn the other cheek. Pillory turns. St. Peter, Trinity of Parse, you have spun my days. You protect me with the lanceolite cage of your 3 pails. You shield me from the world's thrusts, I who delivered you to the soldiers. And the white Christ says, Love one another. And then St. Peter, Before the cock crowed, you blessed me. Before the cock crowed, I denied you thrice. Christ of green, like the hilt of a tarnished sword. Christ of gold, mummy of my first idol. Christ of silver, almost secular. Crumbling skeleton that will fall to dust at cockcrow. I feel that you are about to leave me, for your embraces are too passionate. Christ of silver, I flowered around thy bones like a Medusa that would leave the ocean were it given long thigh bones for stilts. Christ of gold, thou hast closeth the world to me with thy luminous reticle. Christ of gold, Christ of silver, Christ of bronze, you have made me one with your shut paradise. The guardian has adapted himself to the wall of the garden gate like a fruit or a fetus to its prison walls of glass. Your disciples are timid birds. Christ of gold, Christ of silver, Christ of bronze, you are established upon a lasting throne, for your people could not subsist without the shepherd who defends. That's the whole scene. The only way to understand that is hermetically, if there is a way to understand it. And then we've got Laurent Tailade, a decadent symbolist writer, also a very, very active and outspoken anarchist activist. Some of you may recognize him because I talk about him sometimes in other contexts. He, as I say, was very outspoken anarchist. In 1894, a restaurant he was eating in was bombed by anarchists. He lost an eye in the bombing and went to trial to testify in the anarchist's defense, saying, I deserve to have my eye blown out, I shouldn't have been in that bourgeois place anyway. So he's pretty hardcore. He's also involved with hermeticism. He keeps it pretty quiet in his work, but we'll see him coming up in other contexts in ways that are kind of interesting to see him come up in. Whoa, up here is the bombing, and here is his eye getting blown out. You can see they drew the little Victor-Émile Michelet, a symbolist poet involved with theosophy and spiritualism. He ended up writing a lot of books on the relationship between Hermeticism and art, which do a lot, although I haven't gotten to read them yet. They're in French and rare and expensive. But apparently do a lot to theorize specifically how symbolism dealt with the occult in its work. And also wrote one of the kind of key memoirs of the occult community in Paris at the time. We'll see all these people come up again. Edward Dubout, another poet, a homosexual poet actually, interestingly, maybe. And he was a spiritualist medium as well. He was also co-founder of the Mercure de France, which is one of the most important avant-garde journals of the 19th century. So we'll see him quite a bit too. He's leading sessions, he's leading the seances at Gourmand and Courrier's home, which we'll see more of later. We'll see all those people. He's pretty political volatile. At one point he was a Bonapartist imperialist, and then he swung over to become like a far-left socialist and seems to have kind of gone wherever the winds blew. And then we've got this guy, Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. So along with Gustave Moreau, which we'll look at in a minute, he was kind of the alternative avant-garde path to the one most people know. Most people, if you think of the avant-garde in the 1870s and 80s, are going to be thinking about Impressionism. This is the other direction the avant-garde went, which is very consciously the opposite of Impressionism. They're like, we don't care about the science of how the eyeball sees shit. We don't care. What we're trying to do is paint what the eye can't see in the first place. And so Puvis de Chavannes is putting together these kind of hybrid allegories, utilizing several different pantheons, and creating these kind of dreamscapes. It really feels a lot like the Parnassian poetry feels a lot like his stuff. So here's a self-portrait of him and some of his students. Interesting because like here they are in modern stuff as if they're painting from nature, but what is it they're painting from nature? It's a bunch of Greek goddesses. It's going to take a look at, I don't need to talk a lot about these, it's kind of self-evident. So Puvis de Chavannes really is starting to push, especially spiritualism, into the visual arts again. And you've got Gustave Moreau. Highly syncretic stuff. Like you end up with gods and characters from all kinds of pantheons just jammed together in his paintings, which are meant to give you basically a sensory overload to the point where it creates a mystic state. And if you see them in person, because his paintings, the way he uses the transparency of the paint cannot be reproduced in photographs. You have to actually see these pieces in person for them to really do their full kind of work on you. But he's combining a lot of these things. He'll usually base a story on one pantheon, and he'll integrate aspects of a bunch of other stuff into it to kind of create his own idiosyncratic take on each myth that he deals with. He basically refuses to do really illusionistic stuff. There are moments of illusionism in his paintings, and then in other parts of the paintings it just falls apart, which is really kind of the way that he's looking at the world. The world is always solid when you're engaged in its solidness, but the idea of magic is that you can make that solidness become more flexible. So you can see this is Salome, but this does not really look like 6th century Jewish, 6th century BC Jewish temple. It's involving all kinds of things. And again, you can just kind of look at that kind of oversaturated visual logic of Moreau is something that's very familiar if you're used to looking at alchemical imagery, as is the logic of that syncretic logic. Everything means 10 different things, and then there are different meanings within all of the, between those various meanings. And then you've got Felician Rops looking at all of these occultist artists. Yeah, it's not hard to see the occult element here. Rops is kind of the Baudelaire of the visual arts, but even more Baudelaire than Baudelaire. Baudelaire happened to be Baudelaire. Rops was like, everything's going to be misogynist, Satan worship, everything. And it is. So yeah, that's basically what they are. There's really no didactic element in these things, really. They're mainly erotica, actually. What it does tell you, well, A, he was involved with the occult. This is reflecting maybe both why and because sex magic seems to have been such a huge part of the avant-garde at this time. But again, with the Decadence and Symbolist, you get this intense misogyny that is hard to get past. There's another example of it. He does do a lot. He becomes kind of the primary illustrator of occult avant-garde texts. So you've got this. He illustrates, this is a frontispiece that he did for Baudelaire's Les Épouves. Here's a frontispiece he did for Mallarmé's Poésie, one of the few that aren't misogynist, because Mallarmé doesn't really write about sex very much. Or if he does, you can't tell because it's Mallarmé. And the frontispiece for Péladan's The Vice Supreme, which we'll be looking at Péladan in a minute. Yeah. Moving on with visual artists, the Nabi, which was a hermetic society of mostly visual artists. There were some other people in there. This is only a partial. These are kind of the best known people in the group. It's not the entire group. Lunia Poe is the one probably artists won't know. He was an avant-garde actor and theater director who was the person who actually produced the first production of Jarry's Ubu. So, the Nabi were a mystical order. I've had trouble figuring out exactly what they were about in the little time that I've had to put this together. The word Nabi is Hebrew and Arabic for prophet, I've been told. So this tells us something. They were involved with a kind of primitivist, it was a primitivist movement. So this on the one hand meant that the artwork was primitivist in some sense, stripping things down to an abstract reality. And their lifestyle was also fairly primitivist. They're going out in nature and kind of living simply in the Thoreau kind of way. Here's some examples. Their work does not usually have hermetic themes. It tends to just be landscape or interiors. I think really, if we can, the way that their hermetic project affects it, I think, is in the way that a lot of them make reality disappear into pattern, which is kind of the idea of hermetic correspondence is seeing pattern rather than object. So I think you can kind of see the cognitive element in there, although the subject matter. I mean, Brassol's thing, this is Jesus and Buddha, so, okay, that's on the face of it, got it. But, so yeah, but they were living communally, and this is Nabi costume. So they didn't have ceremonial garments that they wore. This is probably something related, and this is probably a holy book.
There was like a movement in the 19th century that was like across Atlantic, like European and American. There was like an obliteration of like Renaissance-based structure.
Right.
Because we can like emphasize. So like it was like authenticity was surreal.
Right.
And that was something that's surreal is also that
Right.
So authenticity is a measure of like spiritual quality.
Right.
And we're moving towards like a spiritual.
Right.
So like the picture things like obliterated, for spiritual purposes. But they stray away for some reason. Like they move towards like primitive stuff. Like they're saying like tapestry, like craft, but like simplicity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pretty wide, and I'm not getting into the pre-Raphaelites right now, which aren't, it's not through simplicity, but it's kind of similar.
Like, it's a rejection of modernity.
Right.
Like an absolute rejection of modernity. So
Right.
these people are looking at like dudes out in the mountains. What are you making? Not living with the city shit.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And like the Raphaelites were like,
Write their own name.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. So it's you're seeing that, I think, throughout the 19th century, that a lot of the avant-garde, and especially visual artists, interestingly, are moving in that kind of direction.
yeah, I think it's also really important to note that human art was created with law.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, even though they don't come up with the same sort of like hermetical background, like there's still like that crossover between the avant-garde.
Yeah. And I mean, Jarry was very close to the Nabi, to most of them, really. And I'm sure that's part of why Bonnard did it, was Bernard. Because Ubawa, I'm sorry for people who don't know what Ubawa is. If you're in the avant-garde, you know. it's like, do I need to explain who Michael Jackson is? But but Ubawa, which is his most famous thing, it reads as just pure buffoonery. But once you look at it in context of his other work and the people he was working with, you just realize it's the weirdest Hermeticist text you've ever seen. Yeah. So, all right. So then we've got this guy, last of the symbolists I'm going to talk about for the moment. Léonce Fabre de César. So he was a symbolist poet again, involved with Fourierist socialist activism, which some of you remember is the craziest form of socialism, the people with tails for version. He was very heavily involved with Fourierist activism from the 1880s right into World War I. A lot of his literature, a lot of his poetry were Fourierist odes, like poems written for the Fourierist society he hoped would one day exist, but never did. He wrote a Gnostic play. He was a friend of Victor Hugo, and was involved with Hugo's spiritualism as well. In 1885, he starts to write social theory, which I want to learn more about. I have a feeling it's probably kind of disturbing. I'm suspecting. And then around this time, he ends up becoming one of the first priests in the revived Gnostic Church, which is what this is about. So he's actually mainly known now as the founder of the Gnostic Church, but he started out as an avant-garde poet, as did Eliphas Levi, as did Aleister Crowley, as we'll be seeing. In 1899, he starts writing Gnostic treatises and publishing those. And we'll see him a little bit more coming up. Now, we looked at a bunch of painters. Let's look at some musicians briefly. I don't have a lot of information on any of them, but most of them, but they were all involved. Starting off, actually, I'll start off with this guy, Erik Satie, who's, a lot of you probably know who he is. Erik Satie was involved with the Dada movement later, involved with the Cubist movement. He's an amazing musician, also very heavily involved with the cabaret culture and satirical cabaret culture in Paris. He was a Christian hermeticist, but he was a weird kind of Christian hermeticist, kind of like Jarry, who was able to laugh at his own religion and who actually considered laughter to be a part of religious life. And so his form of Christianity could seem pretty blasphemous, but I don't think he was actually trying to be blasphemous per se. So we'll be looking at him a little bit more later on. Debussy, who is not widely thought of as an occultist, but he was looking at a lot of things, certainly at the time, that were considered to be occultism, such as Eastern religion. So he studied Indian music for a while under a Sufi, and that was kind of his route into. From there, he got into spiritualism and started looking into occult stuff. Don't know exactly how that plays into his music. We'll see how Satie's does. We looked at Charles Gounod a little bit. I don't know how heavily involved he was in a lot of forms of occultism, but we saw he was trained by Lemuria, which means he was looking at numerology, which is what a musician would be interested in, right? Music's basically number. And that he does have that Saint Simonist background. I don't know whether he was Saint Simonist. This woman is not very well known. She seems really interesting. Augusta Homais, she was born Irish, and she added the diacritical over her name to francify her name because she actually grew up in France. She was trained by César Franck, and she was a medium, so she spoke with spirits pretty often, apparently. If you remember Mende, the guy who I called out, she, after Gautier's daughter divorced him, she ends up becoming his mistress and having several children with him. I hope he treated her better than he did Judith. I don't really know. Where did all these people hang out and get to know each other, you ask in my head. And then I answer to you this, right here. The bookshop called L'Art Indépendant was, in the late 19th century, seems to have been the main kind of meeting point for specifically for the crossover of the avant-garde and occultism. It was a publishing house as well as a bookstore. Those things usually went together at the time. It published a lot of symbolist stuff and a lot of occult stuff. That combination was what it specialized in. These are all people who hung out there regularly. And by which I don't just mean like they would go to buy books, but they would do readings. They had tables set up in there where people would hang out as if it was a coffee house. So you would just stop by and see who was there and then get in an argument with them about Sophia, Pistis Sophia. Okay. And there's this guy who looks cool. Papou. He also has a cool name that he made up. So Papou kind of continues that popularizing mission of a lifeless levy. A lot of people in the occult community actually really he bothers them because they feel like he's kind of dumbing it down for the masses. Not that he himself is dumbing it down in his own practice, but that they feel like, you don't need, they felt he was doing the coffee table book version of occultism, I guess. But he was pretty heavily involved with a lot of stuff. He started out involved with spiritualism. He was a member of the Theosophical Society. Then he got into alchemy and magic from there. He co-founded another library and publishing house called the Liberté des Merveilleux, or the Bookshop of Marvels, which was kind of the other main occult hangout and publisher. I just didn't happen to come across who actually hung out there, so I can't tell you. Presumably him. And he also started the journal The Initiation, which was the main occult journal in France. He also was a regular at the Chat Noir satirical cabaret, so involved with this kind of avant-garde comedy scene that was happening in Paris at the same time, which is kind of an interesting thing. He then ends... Okay, well, let's see. Here are some of his drawings, which, again, I'm not going to try to really explain. This is a Gnostic diagram, I'll tell you that much. That's all. Not sure. It looks pretty Masonic to me. But obviously it's got, Jewish stuff, which, well, yeah, okay. Definitely Freemasonry. This would be Egyptian Lodge Freemasonry, definitely Jewish, which would mean Kabbalah, B and J. This relates to the tarot. This is the Rosy Cross, or Rosicrucian elements. So you can see the syncretic thing. I guess I can talk about it. Okay. He also was one of the first people in France to resurrect the idea of the tarot. So it's largely because of Papou, as well as Eliphas Levi, that a lot of us know what the tarot is. Even the image of gypsies doing tarot cards wasn't really part of the popular culture until these people were involved. So this is his version of the cards, which shows some of the correspondences that he ascribes to all of these things. So that makes him seem pretty cool. I don't know enough about him to know how responsible he is for what happened with some of his students. But here's a little sidetrack. You've got this guy, René Guénon, who's still a very big name in occultism now. He was trained first by Papou, but he considered Papou to be a little bit wishy-washy. And so he left Papou and joined the Gnostic Church under Fabre de César. He then, Guénon, that is, ends up creating, sorry, it's really dark. Okay, he basically creates a right-wing occult movement called Synarchy, which then gets picked up on in the next generation by this guy, Julius Evola, who weirdly is a Dada, a fascist Dada. He is Italian, he started out as a futurist. I think the other Dadas didn't know at the time he was fascist, and then they found out and he was no longer invited. But he also is actually still a pretty big name in occultism today. And you'll still see him mentioned in context where people don't mention he was actually a fascist. So Guénon's ideology becomes a large part, actually, of the occult fascism that was an aspect of kind of the Hitlerian orbit, and had a big influence on the philosophy of Vichy France. Vichy France, I'm just speaking in French now. So there's that. That's kind of a dead end. I'm not going to go into Evola and everything, but some fucked up stuff came out of all of this stuff, as well as just weird shit. Okay, we've touched on this guy a few times. Now we're going to find out what a crazy motherfucker Joseph Péladan is, or as we might say, the Sâr Joseph Mérodach Péladan. So he is a magist. He's a symbolist, novelist, and playwright. He starts his career in 1882 and 83 with criticism of the artistic salons. So that's how he first gets well known, but he's mainly involved with occultism. So he has a syncretic form of Catholicism. He's very emphatic, like, I am Catholic. I am more Catholic than the Pope. I am as Catholic as it gets. But it's a weird Catholicism because it involves a lot of aspects of Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah, of Rosicrucianism, and a ton of Middle Eastern philosophy. So, like, he considers this, like, the Assyrians to be the primary transmitters of biblical knowledge. I'm not sure exactly how that worked. I'm sure he had an explanation, which I've not read. But, so very odd, he was very obsessed with the Chaldean mysteries. So he's combining all these things in a very strange way. Politically, he's an ultra-Catholic traditionalist. He wants theology, or he wants a theocracy, he hates democracy. He does hate nationalism as well, though. So there's something, I guess. Heavily misogynist, as most people seem to be in the 1890s in the Avant-Garde. So here are some of the people who he's involved with early on. Most of whom we've seen, and a few of whom we're going to be seeing pretty soon here. Notice we got Abbé Boulan coming back. It's been a while since we've seen him, but he is moving back onto the scene, the style. Péladan is very involved with ritual magic, very involved with sex magic, although his sex magic seems to involve a lot of blue balls, basically. His idea is that you should basically tempt yourself and create the largest possible amount of sexual tension and then deny it, and that is how you gain power. This is largely because for him, magic essentially means absolute self-control. That's basically his kind of boiling it down definition of magic. You can get to read all of this about all of this in his multi-volume series of very long programmatic novels called The Vice Supreme, the Supreme Vice, which we saw an illustration of a few minutes ago by Robs. All right, so. You've got all of these guys. He also hangs out with some actual physical alchemists actually trying to make gold, whose names are Albert Poisson and Louis Lucas, who I've not looked into much more than that. I just thought it was interesting that they existed. Here is one of the books from that long series of novels which basically describe the process of initiation as he sees it. We're going to get more of him in a minute, but first we need to meet Stanislas de Guita. There's so many people. So Stanislas de Guita is influenced by, again, a lot of the same people we've been looking at. Dreyfus Levy, Baudelaire, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, and Péladan. Basically, he reads Péladan's the first novel in that series, and it is the thing that converts him to occultism. That happens with a lot of people. There was one guy who actually changed his name to a character from Péladan's novel. So that's how Guittard kind of gets into the scene, so to speak. There are a lot of rumors about Guittard. I'm going to tell you the rumors because they're fun and definitely true. Apparently, according to Jules Bois, who we'll see later, he has a familiar, like a creature that does his bidding that he locks up in his broom closet when he's not setting it out to do evil. So I guess if you would come over to his apartment, you just hear it like banging on the door, supposedly. He wore his apartment was completely draped in red, and he always, when he was in his apartment, wore the vestments of a Roman Catholic cardinal, apparently. According to his friend Worth, who we'll look at later, that red in his room was a symbol for being for being in the rosy cross, being Rosicrucian. And the dressing gown was just a dressing, he just happened to have a red robe. I don't know. What we do know is that he really loved drugs. So one of his main magical procedures was the use of cocaine and morphine, and then occasionally hashish. He loved it. He, in his magical books, he continually recommends that people read Baudelaire's Artificial Paradises, and talks about hashish being capable of giving you out-of-body experiences. So he says. Incidentally, he died young in 1897, blind and wrecked in body from drug abuse. So there we go, along with some of his friends who he dragged down with him. Here are some of those friends. Wait, nope, those are not some of his friends. What happened? Ah, okay, sorry. Here are some of his weird drawings. Again, I'm not going to go through everything. But this would be Adam Kadmon, Adam and Eve, two sides of the same coin. Adam Kadmon being like the ideal man, basically. And then Samael and Lilith would be... I don't know enough about what system he's using to be able to parse that necessarily. And I don't know. Again, here is his friend group. Mostly people at this point we've seen, not quite all of them. Maurice Barré, this guy, was his boyhood friend. They came to Paris together to make their name, and kind of, came up together through symbolism. For people in the Avant-Garde, you may remember him from the last thing that the Dada movement did in Paris was the trial of Barré. It was because he started as a socialist, then became a right-winger, and the Dada group, half of the Dada group decided to put him on trial, and the other half decided that Dada shouldn't be putting anyone on trial, even an asshole. And then they invaded and beat each other up with canes and broke some arms, and that was kind of the end of the Dada movement. All about that guy, who was dead by then. But this also tells you the Dadas were very interested in what these guys were doing. You don't do that to someone you don't care about, right? He also was in touch with actual physical alchemists, two brothers named... I'm sorry, these aren't brothers. So, two guys named Albert Poisson and Louis Lucas. This guy, Edouard Dubout, he gets hooked on cocaine as well. So that's kind of cool. This guy hated him for getting him hooked on cocaine, which is largely because Dubout ends up dying of an overdose of cocaine. So, there we go. Alright, so Guittard, let me just go here because, here we go. So these guys end up not liking each other. Guittard ends up going to visit Boulan in 1886 to talk to him about magic. They seem to get along for a while, but when Guittard leaves, he steals Boulan's magical book, apparently. As soon as Boulan notices that his book has been stolen, he's struck with a heart attack and falls to the floor, at which point Sister Adèle Chevalier, the woman who lives entirely on bread and milk, tells him, it's because Stanislas Guitart has attacked you with his magical thought power. And so at this point now, these guys are going to be in a magical psychic war, apparently. Yeah, this is when it gets good. This is just round 1, notice. So, yeah. Guitart and Péladan then, in the meantime, as well as this guy, Oswald Wirth, who's working with them, and a guy named Abbé Roca, who I'm going to not put up there because it's too many people, learn that, at least they say, that Boulan, first off, they learn that Boulan is definitely practicing sex magic, which they will not have, even though he also practices sex magic, but it's, I guess, the wrong kind or something. Part of the problem is that apparently Boulan boasted that he was, as part of his sex magic rituals, having sex with, and this is a direct translation, humanimals. Some kind of magical creature that was half human and half animal, and he said that if he had sex with them enough, he could make them completely human spirits. I don't know. But anyway, they thought it was fucked up, and so they started attacking him with psychic rays. So, yeah, shit gets cool. Meanwhile, this half of them, these guys, decide that they better consolidate their winnings and found the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix, founded by Stanislas Guitart and Sâr Péladan, and involving all those other guys who we've talked about. So, yeah. So the Kabbalistic Order of the Rose Croix. They claim that there are 12 leaders. There are probably actually 6. 6 of them are secret, and most people figure they probably never existed. They claim there were 100 people in this group. Again, most people figure there are probably not 100 people in the group. But it was all secret, so who knows? There are 3 degrees. The lowest degree would be to understand magic on a biological sense. 2nd degree is the theoretical sense. And 3rd degree is the practical sense, actually doing it. So this works out well for a while, but Péladan is like, it was his idea to become Rosicrucians, apparently, and he wanted to always remind everybody that it was his idea, this is me. Don't forget, I'm the real Rosicrucian. I'm letting you all be Rosicrucians, but I'm the real Rosicrucian, okay? So, let's see. Alright. So, here they all are together. So that's nice. This gets some hint at what went on. That's all I got. That's only a hint. I don't know. This stands for Mercury. I know that. Okay. But, yeah. So what happens is Péladan starts going off the deep end. Let's see. I'm not sure why I got Debut there. Okay, so Péladan starts going off the deep end, basically. Even in this context where people are attacking each other with psychic rays, he goes off the deep end, right? So, Péladan starts, in 1890, he issues 3 manifestos. One is a manifesto to all of the graphic artists in the world. And he says, all the graphic artists in the world, listen up, all art is religious. All religious art is Catholic, whether it knows it or not. This is an interesting argument. Like, even Buddhist art is actually Catholic, if it just doesn't know. Which, of course, means you could do Buddhist art, though, and still be Catholic, right? But all art has to be religious, it has to be figurative, it cannot be experimental, and it should be straight-up Catholic, but it doesn't have to be. A second manifesto is to the Archbishop of Paris, and what he says is, stop bullfighting in Paris. Because he says, bullfighting has just gotten popular in Paris, and he says, I've been there, and when I go, all the women are having orgasms, and it has to stop. This is what the manifesto says. third manifesto is issued to the Rothschild family. And it says, hey, there's a really nice building called the Chateau of Bougon, and one of you is going to tear it down, and don't do it because it's a really cool building, or I will curse you forever. And so he issues these things, and the rest of the group are like, whoa, we're not with that guy, actually. No, we just kicked him out. No. So, yeah, so that kind of ends. And Péladan then says, all right, fuck y'all, I'm going to start my own group now, which is the Catholic Order of the Holy Cross. So this one, he's pretty firm. Well, there are two other guys he co-founds it with who are not involved in the Avant-Garde and don't seem to have done, or three guys, don't seem to have done really anything else. I think they're basically fronts for him, which is why I am worried about getting pictures of them. Notice a complete changeover in group membership here. Nobody went with him. It's all visual artists now who are with him. So, he co-founds this thing. Both of those three co-founders, two of them are poets. One of them's an ex-dandy. His version rejects spiritualism, it rejects Buddhism, and it rejects Freemasonry. It says, like, none of these things have any value. And then he has three statements, which are the kind of leading statements for the group. One is, artist, you are a priest. Art is the great mystery. 2, artist, you are king. Art is the true empire. 3, artist, you are magus. Art is the great miracle. So, absolutely, art and occultism are being combined into one thing here. And they start having what are called the Salon of the Rose plus Croix, or Rose plus Croix, however you want to say it. And so this is an avant-garde, occult avant-garde exhibition that goes on for 2 years, supposedly on the lines of art that he'd laid down, although not everything quite matches up totally. Everything is supposed to have religious subjects, and there's no abstraction allowed, which is impossible, because abstraction isn't really an either-or thing. But anyway, he didn't understand that. So there we are. Here are some posters for it. He got some pretty important people to be involved. You were not allowed to do portraiture unless it was holy portraiture, such as portraiture of the Sâr Péladan, who's calling himself Merodach now. It's one of the characters from his own novel that he's calling himself. So, involved in here are a lot of the artists that we've looked at, not surprisingly. Puvis de Chavannes, Félix Vallotton from the Nabi group, Eric Satie, who composes music for the salons and composes music for the plays that they put on there. Moreau we've looked at, Rox we've looked at. We haven't looked at Carlos Schwab and Fernand Nup, but other people involved in there. They would have the visual art, but they would also do concerts of Rosicrucian music and plays written by the Sâr Péladan. Here he is in one of them. You can tell it's pretty ramshackle. Like, the backdrop looks about as professional as my slide projector thing here. And those would be almost like happenings. Those plays were kind of, they involved all of the senses. So he would have very low light, so you had to really look through the shadows and stuff. They were basically initiatory rituals with an audience. A lot of incense, which both had smoke, and the scent was kind of making people go like, what's going on? So it was all about really creating a full physical experience. Like Alfred Jarry was a big fan of these plays, actually. After the second year, though, a lot of the artists were kind of like, this stuff is kind of silly, and I don't know what Péladan's talking about. He's kind of acting like an asshole. And most of the artists who had much name in the avant-garde dropped out after the second year. Puvis de Chavannes actually wrote a public letter saying, like, yo, I got nothing to do with that guy anymore. Just let it be known. Other people were like, hey, why not start our own splinter group of the splinter group, like Eric Satie, who starts the Metropolitan Church of Art of Jesus the Conductor. I don't know much about it, unfortunately. I think it's probably the most fun of all of these. because again, Satie was a jokester. He came out of cabaret culture, and his attitude toward Christianity was complicated enough to involve a lot of humor. Yeah. Moving on to Berthe Courier. We've talked about her a little bit here. So she is kind of the center of the avant-garde Satanist community in 1890s Paris. That is a thing you can actually say. She was the center of that community. She was a writer, mainly known as actually an artist model. She was an outspoken proponent of psychology, which is pre-Freudian, so this is Charcot and Janet. She considered psychology to be inherently misogynist, which, if you look at the way hysteria was treated, makes a whole lot of sense. So she wrote some manifestos against psychology, which probably plays into her embracing magic. Here are some of the people she was closely involved with, all of whom at this point we've seen, except for this guy, Auguste Clesinger, who was a Romanticist sculptor. He was George Sand's nephew, for what it's worth. I'll be talking about him in a minute. So Berthe Courier apparently went around dressed in sackcloth, like a dress made out of sackcloth. So kind of taking on what you would have done in the Middle Ages. You would wear sackcloth for penance, but she just makes a nice dress out of it. Wore a bright blonde wig all the time and a hood, wore huge men's sandals, and carried around with her all the time a bag filled with consecrated wafers that she would just feed to dogs on the street. So she was definitely Satanist. She had a necklace made of homemade cockerel feathers. There are things about the description of her, I've never seen anyone make this connection, but things in the description remind me of Baroness Ilse von Freytag-Loringhoven, the Dada artist. Both of them received a lot of very misogynist treatment, and were like, this lady's fucking crazy. You know, she's always coming on to me, even though she's over the age of 20. So she takes a lot of shit in the literature that I think is a lot to do with misogyny. She would apparently go to confession every week and make up the most outrageous stories she could to try to make the priests horny, basically, just to fuck with them. As we've already seen, she and Gourmand, who were doing spiritualist table turning in their house with Boulan. So she had three big loves of her life, let's say. So there's this guy who I mentioned, Auguste Clesinger. After he died, she had an affair with this guy, Georges Boulanger, who was a French general turned populist politician. So he was a populist right-wing politician, if that sounds familiar, who basically almost staged a coup d'etat to take over France and turn it into a totalitarian regime, but he basically just happened to die before it happened. Like, it was really, everybody in France was just like, whew, the poor people were about to put in a horrible man. And that seems to have been it. But I don't know, I guess she saw something in him. After he died, she hooked up with Rémy de Gourmand, the Symbolist publisher and poet. And that is when they started having seances at their house. Again, we're going to be seeing a lot more of her in a little bit, but she is involved. So she financed a lot of the Symbolist journals, and she financed the print journal I talked about with Gourmand and Jarry. She she probably helped to get Jarry out of the army when he was drafted. Keep that in mind when we talk about her and Jarry later. She probably got him out of the army. She is portrayed in a lot of Symbolist novels. So Gourmand, her lover, portrayed her in 2 different novels. She is also portrayed in a novel by Eastmans, who we'll look at in a minute. So there are a lot of fictionalized versions of her out there to read. She was heavily involved with sex magic, Satanist sex magic, a lot of S&M, apparently. Incubism, or again, basically creating spiritual people who she then had sex with, as it turns out. She, in 1890, goes to Belgium to visit a priest named Van Eyck. His reputation before and after is perfect, so most people are like, we don't think he did anything at all. It was probably just her casting aspersions. But what happened is she went up to visit him for apparently no reason, according to most people, and was found 2 days later in shock, naked in some bushes, trembling and unable to speak. She was put into an asylum, and it took Gourmand 2 months of bureaucracy to get them to release her. Again, it's interesting that they're like, probably nothing happened. And I'm like, that sounds like something happened. But I could be wrong. Maybe not. So anyway, at one point, when she was at a seance at Gourmand's house, her ex, General Boulanger, turned up in the seance, and apparently he was really ugly. But I haven't any details, unfortunately. But it's that guy as a ghost. Alright, so then we move on to... oh wait, that's what I should do. Okay, back to Jarry, though. So, as we saw, she was close to Alfred Jarry, who is pretty damn important. And she ends up writing him a very odd letter in which she says, basically, look, I've created an entire other world that I can walk into and exist in anytime I want, and I control everything in it. And if you want, you can come to me and we will inhabit that world and live in it as king and queen forever. So this is what she writes to Jarry. I'm going to give you just a few bits of it. I don't have time to read the whole thing, but... so here she says, I possess a power greater than all others, which contains them all, occult and unknown. Do you want it? I possess the golden keys that open the ivory portals of the realm of dreams. Like Persephone, who weaves in a veil the lives of future humanities, I will cause every image that exists to pass before your eyes. Symbols will become embodied. They will become a marvelous population, inaccessible to men. Do you wish for them? By my action upon you, ideas will hasten in a throng to your brain. Forms will take on a life and furnish us with a cortege such as no dictator ever had. Come, we shall reign with an uncontested power over a people created by ourselves. And she goes on. So Jarry, being the gentleman he is, says, what do I do with this? He decides to publish the entire letter in a pornographic novel. Well, obviously, her husband, his best friend, doesn't take this real well. I'm sure she doesn't either. So that's basically the end of Jarry and Gourmand's friendship. It's the end of their collaboration. It's the end of their journal. And Jarry is, at this point, closed out of half of the Symbolist publications out there because he's just kind of made himself persona non grata by being a dick. So there's that. She's also portrayed as a character in a novel by this guy, Joris Huysmans. So he started out as a naturalist novelist, so basically a novelist as reporter. The closest thing I could say to like what the naturalists, this is coming out of the Zola, were trying to do would be like The Wire today. So Huysmans comes out of this milieu, but what he decides is, what if I, instead of doing like, you know, a searing journalistic, very precise expose of like how the lower middle class lives, what if I do it how crazy fucking intellectuals live? And so he does a realist novel about decadence, subculture, and ends up becoming a decadent himself through doing this research. So he first writes a book called A Rebours, or Against Nature, which describes basic society of the avant-garde at the time, and then Là-bas, or Down There, or In Hell, depending how you translate it, which is basically a novel about avant-garde Satanism in 1890 in Paris, which is a really crazy book, which I recommend. And she ends up being one of the main characters in that novel. So Ismals gets himself really embroiled in the occult community as he's doing this. So he's close to Villiers, Gourmand, Courier, basically all of that group. His day job is actually he's a clerk in the Ministry of the Interior, which means he actually sees a lot of spies, reports of spies who are spying on these avant-garde occult groups. So he actually has information about some of these people that was not publicly available just through his work. He also seems to have been fairly gullible. He seems to have pretty much believed anything that people told him, which when people are having like psychic wars is not necessarily to your advantage. So he goes to stay with, well, let's just say, he ends up getting involved in round 2 of the magical warfare between Guiton and Boulan. So, Ismals, as part of his research, goes up to hang out with Boulan. So he stays at Boulan's house for a few weeks, doing research for the novel. Befriends him, and he becomes involved in this war that we've been talking about. In 1893, Boulan dies, and so he dies. Ismals accuses the Rosicrucians of using magic to murder him through psychic rays. Which seems pretty likely, everything considered, I guess. Sorry, I'm getting lost here. And there are a lot of details here. So, alright. So Ismals accuses him partly because, according to Ismals, the day after Boulan dies, a letter arrives from these guys sentencing him to death by magical execution. Supposedly. Julie Thibault, who is this lady, the lady in the picture. So the woman who had first told Boulan that he was being attacked by Guiton ends up becoming Ismals' housekeeper after Boulan dies. So she now moves in with Ismals. Boulan's dead, and then shortly after, Dubout dies of that cocaine overdose I was talking about, which Ismals obviously says clearly this was another magical murder by the Rosicrucians. So he's like privately accusing them of doing this, basically. While he's doing that, you end up with Jules Blois, who I can't find a picture of, another symbolist, poet, occultist. For some reason, hears Ismals accuse them, and Blois goes nuts, and he's like, they definitely did it, and he publishes a newspaper article saying, these dudes killed that guy with psychic rays in the newspaper. So, now we're getting into a more public kind of spat, at which point, so what he says it's volatilized poison. So what he says they did was that they turned the poison into air, like into atoms, and then sent those atoms shooting over, like, France, and then, like, inside his brain, and poisoned him that way, apparently. Guiton says, I don't even practice practical magic. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm basically a philosopher. And he challenges Ismals and Blois to a duel. So he challenges them to a duel. Ismals is like, never mind, I don't want to get in a duel with the sorcerer. So he kind of steps back, but Blois is like, bring it on! So now Blois is going to have a duel. So I don't know who his seconds are, couldn't figure it out. But Guittat, for his seconds, for his side of the duel, chooses Michelet and his boyhood friend, Maurice Barré. Worth is just kind of in the background, being like, yeah, go get him. So this is confusing, but it's about to get more confusing, because, you know, the seconds have to go meet the other seconds and deliver, you know, and they have to do their whole ritual agreement about how everything's going to go down. But that doesn't work very well, because as they're doing it, Michelet gets in a fight with whoever this guy is, and ends up challenging him to a duel. So that now, this guy can't be a second, because he's in a duel with the other second. This guy needs replaced. Barré is now Michelet's second, so he's moved out of this duel, leaving Guittat with no seconds. So he has to go back to the Avant occult community and be like, yo, can somebody be my second? And Papou and Laurent Telade are like, yeah, we can be your second. So finally we're ready for that frickin' duel. Okay. So, so far so good. One thing that is not necessarily great for Jules Blois, though, is that Telade, like I said, he's a really outspoken anarchist, which means he has lots of enemies. So Telade has actually been in 23 duels already. So he knows how to duel, not that he's actually going to be firing, so I guess that helps. Yeah. So Telade's been in a lot of duels. For what it's worth, he also had his house burned down once by a bunch of people angry about his being anarchist. Actually, I don't think it was his house, it was his friend's house he was staying at. Anyway, so they go to duel. On the way to the duel, Jules Blois, the horses on his carriage get spooked for no reason and just stand still in the street for half an hour and won't move. So he's like, this is obviously magic. I'm being attacked already by the Rosicrucians. So he gets out, he gets another carriage, and the same thing happens. But this time the horses stop and then the carriage turns over. He gets out, walks to the thing, has the duel, nobody gets hurt. Blois and Papou end up like making friends during the duel somehow, and end up like walking off to go get dinner together afterward. Meanwhile, afterward, the seconds look at the guns and realize one of the guns actually misfired. But by that point, it was too hard to know which one it was, because they're both identical. But Jules Blois was definitely certain about which one it was. So, thus ended the second wizard battle in the Avant-Garde in the 1890s. All over East Mons, who didn't even end up taking part in it. So, just to wrap up his part in the whole matter, he ends up being actually blackmailed by Henriette Maillot, who was Péladan's mistress. Péladan, the Tsar. Her ex-mistress tries to blackmail him with love letters of hers that he had published in Labat. But he then says, hey, I work for the spy department, are you sure you want to blackmail me? And she said, no, never mind, and backed down. So there we go. Alright, there's some crazy French shit. On to the British a little bit, who are closely related to the French. The first lecture, I hardly had any British people, because the Avant-Garde basically was French in the first part of the 19th century. It started out as a local community, which is something I think is easy to forget. It started out as just like the underground Parisian community, and it just got super crazy. Second half of the century, it starts to spread to Germany and England. But even there, it's largely through the French influence. So these are kind of the people in the British Symbolist movement, which is usually called aestheticism, who were most involved in bringing that French influence into England. Most of whom are kind of new faces for the moment, but we're about to become familiar with them. So, so let me see. So here we go. Here we go. Okay, so these are the British aestheticists we're going to be talking about today. We're nearing the end here, don't worry. Okay, William Butler Yeats. So, Yeats is like almost everybody we've been looking at, coming out of the cult of art. In England, the cult of art starts to be called art for art's sake. And without getting too much into it, this is largely coming through the reinterpretation of Gautier's theories by Walter Pater, who is the mentor of Oscar Wilde. And so it's the kind of very depoliticized association we have with art for art's sake is mainly coming from the British misreading of the French idea, if that makes some sense. Yeats is coming out of that art for art's sake, or cult of art tradition, though. Very much coming out of the Messianic tradition. The idea that he, like Victor Hugo, is speaking for his culture. Victor Hugo was the voice of France and the voice of the century. He was, as Mallarmé said, the instrument through which the century spoke. William Blake is somebody who, again, he's probably of these people the one who Yeats talks about the most being influential. Makivich, we looked at in the first lecture, as being kind of one of the first modern poet to really fill this messiah role for the Polish in his instance. So Yeats was involved with the cult of art, Messianism, Hermeticism, spiritualism, astrology, Hinduism, Buddhism, all of these things he was really involved with. He claimed that occultism was at the heart of his work, that you could not understand his work without understanding his occult commitments. Politically, he was committed to the Irish Renaissance and to Irish independence, and he used Irish myth in the way the Parnassians had done, as a way to do that. In the 19th century, at the point we're looking at, he's involved with democratic Irish independence movements. Later in the 20th century, he moves more and more to the right, and eventually ends up as a fascist, unfortunately. Again, I didn't have to make all of these. I didn't have to keep saying, and then they became a fascist with the first part of the lecture. He actually co-edited the first complete edition of Blake's work, and he was the one who rediscovered Blake's poem, The Four Zoas. So he did that. Here are some of his notebooks. I'm just going to look at a few of his magical notebooks here, which I think are pretty interesting. And this would have been stuff he was doing probably around the Golden Dawn. This is Kabbalistic stuff. This is Rosicrucian, so this is kind of getting at, let's see, Rose from Cross, he says here. So this is coming at the inheritance from Eliphas Levi and the Rosicrucian groups. Here he is dealing with the Kabbalah, so here's the Tree of Life, we looked at that earlier. With the Hebrew letters, so he's actually working with Hebrew. So Yeats is doing this. In 1885, he founds the Dublin Hermetic Order. The next year, he joins the Theosophical Society. In 1886, he starts having seances at his house. And then in 1911, he becomes a member of something called the Ghost Club, which investigates paranormal occurrences and decides whether they're real or not. There are a number of those going on around the turn of the century. Kind of by people who wanted to believe but didn't want to be duped. You know, they're like, maybe there are ghosts, but we need to actually find out. Basically the beginning of ghost hunting. Another interesting artist, Pamela Coleman Smith, who sometimes worked just under the pseudonym Pixie. So she was an American artist that was based in London. She painted synesthetic visions which came in response to music. So going back to the Parnassians, listens to music and then paints what the music makes her see, dealing directly with those correspondences. She was actually the first painter to be shown at Stieglitz's Gallery 291, which was originally a photography gallery. So she has that connection with Dada, having shown in the Dada Gallery. Obviously later after this period. So here are some of her pieces, some of these synesthetic pieces. Clear occult stuff. But she's best known for doing the illustrations for the Rider-Waite Tarot deck, which you've probably seen in one form or the other, at any rate. So she's pretty interesting. Also involved at the time is another Irishman, in addition to Yeats, Oscar Wilde, who we talked to. Eastmans, Arabor, and Labat had a huge influence on him. If you've read Dorian Gray, the book that corrupts Dorian Gray is Eastmans Arabor, Beyond Against Nature, which Wilde talks about in his letters. So that's what it was. He doesn't quite name it in the story, but if you know the book, you know what it is. So Wilde is kind of the standard bearer for the cult of art for his generation. And not depoliticized, Wilde was a socialist. Although his form of socialism does not sound anything like Marx. And obviously a kind of working for gay rights, but more doing so after he had to because he'd been thrown in prison. I don't want to make him sound too selfless there, but also Algernon Swinburne, kind of the British Baudelaire, you might say. Definitely involved with like the Baudelairean brand of Satanism, not Satan worship, but kind of the exploration of the satanic part of human nature. He's kind of he's like the dark Tennyson. Like if you like Tennyson but he bores you, read Swinburne. Yeah. And then the most famous in the occult circles is going to be Aleister Crowley, who began as a British symbolist poet and occultist. He was immersed in Eliphas Levi, who we've already looked at a lot. Levi has a huge influence on Crowley's system. He talks about him all the time, as he talks about Papu a lot too. And he starts writing his early work when he's writing as a poet are poems and hymns that have been dictated to him in mesmeric trances by angels, according to him. And especially later in his career, he gets very involved in Enochian, and he's actually transcribing Enochian poems, which is technically sound poetry, actually. So that's kind of interesting. I'm going to read a real short Aleister Crowley poem here, which will be my last reading. And this is called Invocation, an oath written during the dawn meditation. Oh, thanks, Ron. Awaz, confirm my troth with thee, that my will inspire with secret sperm of subtle, free, creating fire. Mold thou my very flesh as thine, renew my birth in childhood merry as divine enchanted earth. Dissolve my rapture in thine own, a sacred slaughter, whereby to capture and atone the soul of water. Fill thou my mind with gleaming thought, intense and rare, to one refined, outflung to naught, the word of air. Most, bridal bound, my quintessential form thus freeing, from self be found one selfhood blent in spirit being. Alright, so I don't know why she's here again. That leads us to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, 1888 to 1903. Short-lived, but it is very famous. So, where is it? The Order, okay. The Golden Dawn basically creates a syncretic ritual. It's syncretic ritual magic. A lot, again, like Eliphas Levi. Based in the Kabbalah, it's very difficult to really get very many details because it was a secret organization. And basically they attempt to be like, well, you would know this if you were in the third order of the fifth aeon. And you're like, okay, I'm not. I don't know. But this gives us some idea of these, like, these orders that get founded at the end of the century are obsessed with hierarchies and levels of knowledge and levels of initiation, which comes from Gnosticism. Gnosticism was this kind of series of your mind is baptized over and over and over again as you get closer and closer and closer to be moving beyond thought. So their hierarchy is structured the same way, along Kabbalistic lines. The third order, which you don't even know the name of, is in the order of existence. These are the three Sephirot which precede existence. So that's why there is no name. This would be in the middle. This is when you're first, like, This is the stuff you can just read about and understand. That's kind of the first level. Yeah, and this is the main reason it's so well known, even though it was pretty short-lived. There are a lot of famous people involved, especially literary people. Particularly William Butler Yeats was a pretty dominating force on it. I've already kind of talked about Yeats, so I'm not going to go into a lot more. He did the same stuff as part of the Order of the Golden Dawn. Aleister Crowley actually got initiated pretty late in the game. Here he is. I don't know which of these is the funnier costume, but you can take your pick. Pamela Coleman Smith is in there, who I've already talked about. Algernon Blackwood is a pretty interesting guy. He was a deist, a pantheist, and a spiritualist, but with a pretty skeptical bent. So he also was involved in a lot of these ghost hunting societies and things trying to decide whether these things were real or not. He is a novelist. He's a weird fiction novelist. Actually becomes one of the biggest influences on H.P. Lovecraft. His stuff, it's like pantheist horror. It tends to be haunted forests and haunted valleys and haunted hills instead of haunted houses. He's very interested in in kind of the spirit of a place and how that, I guess, how human psychology changes in interface with nature. He also has some of the first psychic detective stories. Like he's actually got a character. He has in a few stories who's a psychic detective tracking down the kinds of murders that apparently were taking place in Paris. So really amazing horror writer. Another amazing horror and weird fiction writer involved in the Golden Dawn, Arthur Machen. Arthur Machen was a Christian mystic, but also had a very heavy pantheist kind of element to him. Really loved Celtic folklore, and a lot of his stories are about, it's weird fiction, it's horror, but it's about kind of hauntings by fairies and earth spirits, and really kind of, it's almost about the pagan, almost about pagan religion kind of breaking through the Christianity that was permeating, the society. It made that Christianity seem like a very thin veil that these older beliefs kind of come through. After the Golden Dawn, he got kind of scared by where he was going and returned to the Anglican Church. But again, a very huge influence on H.P. Lovecraft. Here are just a few other women that were involved, but I guess they're not all women. Most of them I couldn't find a whole lot about their occult activities, so I just kind of know they were involved. They kind of sound interesting. Florence Farr was an actress, a feminist activist, and a socialist, involved in the Golden Dawn. Don't know much more about her, but it is kind of interesting here. She's dressing the part, Maud Gonne was an actress and an activist for Irish independence, and a socialist and feminist activist, and a member of the Golden Dawn. Again, I don't know much more. Gustav Meyrink was German, and actually, so he is a Buddhist and a syncretic occultist. He also a pacifist. He ended up protesting World War I, and German nationalism during World War I. He is one of the founders of German Expressionism, so there's a direct link with the 20th century avant-garde. That is mainly it. I'm just going to go through that pretty much brings us to the 20th century. Briefly going over some of the subsequent movements. Cubism is the first thing to happen after this period. You can see the influence of a lot of this stuff in for instance, the Cubist poet Max Jacob was a Christian mystic. He would sit in his apartment and have conversations with the Virgin Mary until he was killed in the Holocaust. Raymond Roussel did a lot of gematria. You don't see a lot of occultism in the Cubist painters, but you do see it in some of the writers. Expressionism, we just saw Meyrink. Kandinsky is somebody who's obviously drawing on a lot of the stuff we've just seen with color theory, idea of correspondences and synesthesia. Even automatic drawing, I think, is probably starting to have an influence on Kandinsky, though it doesn't really, come out until art and some of the surrealists. Hugo Ball starts as an expressionist, then becomes a Dadaist. Hugo Ball, the mystical element is right there. Dada, there are a few books looking at Dada and surrealism as occult movements, straight up. It completely permeates those movements. Chance is a form of magic in Dada, right? And it plays off of the idea of correspondences, really. The reason that chance works is because everything's interconnected. So chance is it's a radicalized way of accessing that continuity without staking your claim on continuity, as it were. Hugo Ball, Max Ernst, Kurt Schwitters, all of the Paris Dadas were all very involved with occultism. Surrealism, which is basically Paris Dada plus a bunch of other people, started out as a research group, not an artistic group. They had a house where they did research. They did experiments on the human mind. That was what it was about for the first year. And most of those involved seances, automatic writing, which for them was coming out of spiritualism, automatic speaking, which is actually not that far from Enochian angels talking to you. Most of the things that they were doing, as we've seen, they were aware were being done before them in earlier versions of the Avant-Garde. The Grand Jeu group, which if you've not heard of, is worth looking at. They were asked to join the Surrealists and refused. They were doing a lot of the same kind of thing. They were doing group experiments and out-of-body experiments. They claimed that they could, they knew each other so well, they could both have out-of-body experiences and dreams, meet the next day, and they both remembered the same thing that they did together, apparently. So they were doing the same kinds of things, doing out-of-body, transmutation, transmigration of souls, altered states of consciousness, and things like that. The Acéphale group, around the same time, with Bataille, also is taking this idea of a secret society. They actually wanted to do a human sacrifice, but nobody was willing to volunteer. Surprise, surprise. Bataille is definitely looking at a lot of this stuff. Mystical anthropology would be one way to look at one wing of Bataille's work. This idea of the sacred as opposed to the divine, I think, sheds a lot of light on a lot of these earlier practices. And this idea of sacrifice. Pataphysics, I've talked about with Sâr E, but you have a college of pataphysics that's founded in the 20th century and a whole tradition of people building on that. The Oulipo group, which comes out of pataphysics, which is mathematical literature. People writing is basically a form of Kabbalistic gematria. It's radicalized for poetic practice. The Vienna actionists were doing ritual sacrifices, which is definitely coming out of stuff that Péladan and the Rose Croix was doing. Look at Ed Sanders in the 60s through the present as an American who was doing, working very heavily with Egyptian mythology, looking at his poems as spells, trying to revive the bardic tradition, which is not far from the messianic tradition. And then finally, kind of into the current day, you've got Neoism, which is kind of the most recent worldwide avant-garde movement, which is heavily involved with chaos magic. The Temple of Psychic Youth, Church of the Subgenius. Genesis P. Orridge talks all the time about occultism. Tentatively Inconvenience talks all the time about occultism. It's really heavily all over that place. So I'm going to stop there. It's probably over time. So, all right, that's all I got. Just answer questions if you want, or just grab me afterwards.